Kentucky, 1997. A cold case that haunted a quiet community for nearly 3 decades has finally been solved. Marcus Elwood Granger, a 41-year-old auto body mechanic known for his quiet dedication to his teenage son and after-hours restoration work, vanished one summer evening without a trace. His truck was found abandoned along a desolate county road, tools still in the bed and the driver's door wide open. No blood, no struggle, just silence. Despite desperate efforts, the investigation stalled amid limited forensic tools and whispered allegations of negligence. But now, years later, DNA technology has cracked open the truth, and the arrest has sent shockwaves through the town. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Marcus Elwood Granger wasn't the kind of man who made headlines. He made engines hum, brakes stop on a dime, and old cars shine like new. In the heart of rural Kentucky, in the modest town of Beckley Hollow, Marcus was the man people trusted with their vehicles, and sometimes their troubles. He never charged extra for single moms. He always left a light on in his garage for after-hours emergencies. And he always made it home in time to eat dinner with his teenage son Jamie. Granger Auto sat just off Route 16, where the road dips between a rust-colored ravine and a line of dense pine. The building wasn't much. Corrugated steel siding, a gravel lot, a faded Coca-Cola machine humming just outside the front office. But inside it held history. Marcus's father opened it in the late 60s, and Marcus had grown up with oil-stained hands and a passion for carburetors and crankshafts. After his father passed, he kept the name, never rebranded, because that name meant something in Beckley Hollow. Marcus was a widower. His wife, Dana, had died of complications from pneumonia when Jamie was just 9. It hit him hard, harder than he let on. But in grief, he poured himself into 2 things: raising Jamie and keeping the shop alive. He became a quiet fixture in the town, the kind of man who didn't need to say much to be heard. Reliable, kind, unshakable. By 1997, Jamie was 15, tall like his father, quieter than most kids his age. They had a routine: breakfast at the corner diner on Saturdays, movie rentals from the gas station on Sundays. Jamie sometimes helped out at the shop, learning how to sand down rust or gap a spark plug. It was simple. It was theirs. That summer had been unusually hot, the kind of summer where the air felt heavy and the roads shimmered. Marcus had just taken on a new job, restoring a 1968 Camaro for a local middle school teacher. She wanted to surprise her husband on their anniversary. Marcus loved that kind of work. He called it bringing ghosts back to life. He told Jamie he might even take on more restoration jobs once school started again. No one could have predicted what would come next. On August 14th, Marcus closed the shop a little later than usual. He was making good progress on the Camaro. He called Jamie from the office phone and said he'd be home soon. Jamie remembers the call. His dad sounded tired but upbeat. Said they might grill burgers that weekend. That was the last time anyone heard Marcus's voice. By the next morning, the silence was deafening. Jamie, worried when his father didn't come home, called around. Neighbors, family, friends. At first, people assumed Marcus had run an errand or stayed late at the shop. But by mid-morning, it became clear something was wrong. Marcus's truck was missing. His wallet was still at the garage. The Camaro sat untouched, the tools laid out like he meant to return in 5 minutes. People in Beckley Hollow didn't just disappear. Not men like Marcus, and just like that, the rhythm of life in the town broke, replaced by whispers, worry, and an emptiness no one could explain. What happened on that warm August night that took Marcus away from everything he loved? August 14, 1997, began like any other summer Thursday in Beckley Hollow. The midday heat shimmered off the pavement. Cicadas buzzed relentlessly. In town, folks went about their business, stopping for coffee, chatting on porches, waving at passing trucks. At Granger Auto, Marcus Elwood Granger was elbow-deep in the restoration of a 1968 Camaro. It was his kind of project, and challenging, personal. The teacher who'd brought it in said it was a gift for her husband, and Marcus wanted it to be perfect. He skipped lunch, worked through the afternoon, and finally wiped his hands on a rag as the sun dipped low on the horizon. It was 6:15 p.m., later than he usually stayed. He picked up the dusty shop phone and called home. Jamie answered. The call was brief. Be home by 7, Marcus said. Don't start dinner without me. Those were the last words Jamie would ever hear from his father. When 7 p.m. passed without headlights pulling into the driveway, Jamie didn't panic. Not at first. Maybe his dad had stopped for gas or groceries. Maybe a customer had flagged him down for help. It happened all the time. But by 8:15, the anxiety began to gnaw. Jamie called a neighbor, Mrs. Lawton, who lived just 2 doors down. She hadn't seen Marcus. He wasn't at the shop either. She'd driven by. The place was locked, lights out. By 9 p.m., Jamie was pacing the front porch. He called the sheriff's office at 10:02 p.m., his voice trembling as he tried to explain that his father wasn't the kind of man who disappeared. Deputies responded quickly. In Beckley Hollow, a missing adult, especially Marcus Granger, wasn't brushed aside. By 11:40 p.m., a patrol car spotted Marcus's truck, the faded red Ford F-150 everyone in town recognized, parked awkwardly along Old Mill Road, a winding stretch of 2-lane asphalt bordered by thick woods and an old grain silo long out of use. The truck was facing west, toward the hills. Its driver's side door hung open, as if someone had exited in a hurry. The keys were gone. The glove box closed. Wallet missing. But what truly unnerved investigators was what they didn't find. No blood, no struggle, no broken glass or signs of a fight. The truck bed still held Marcus's tools, neatly arranged like always. The engine was cold, suggesting it had been parked for hours. There were no footprints leading into the woods. No tire marks, nothing. By dawn, the news had spread. In a town where everyone knew each other, where people left their doors unlocked and waved at every passing car, Marcus's disappearance hit like a storm. Granger Auto remained shuttered that morning. Jamie, surrounded by neighbors and distant family, sat silent at the kitchen table. Theories surfaced immediately. Maybe he'd walked off and had a breakdown, finally overwhelmed by grief. Maybe he'd been robbed. Maybe it was something darker. But those who knew Marcus knew one thing for sure. He would never leave Jamie behind. Never. Search teams were formed. Volunteers combed the nearby woods. Drones and dogs were deployed. But with no clear trail, the search turned up nothing but dust and silence. It was as if Marcus had simply stepped off the face of the earth. Who would want to harm Marcus? And why were there no signs of a struggle? It was September 6, 1997, a Saturday morning cloaked in fog and stillness. The woods along the northern edge of Beckley Hollow were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a mourning dove. A local hunter, Scott Thayer, was out early, hoping to track deer near the old logging trails. He didn't expect to find a body. Pushing through a dense thicket just off the trail, Scott noticed something unusual, a glint of metal on the forest floor. At first he thought it was trash, maybe a discarded beer can, but as he stepped closer, the shape became unmistakable. Bone, scattered, weather-worn, and next to it, nestled in a patch of pine needles, was a ring, a gold wedding band still looped loosely around what remained of a finger bone. Shaken, Scott backed away and called 911 from his truck. Within hours, crime scene investigators had descended on the area. The location was roughly 10 miles north of where Marcus's truck had been found. Remote. Hidden. The kind of place no one stumbled into by accident. The remains were partial. Time, weather, and wildlife had taken their toll. Skeletal fragments lay strewn across the underbrush, bones sun-bleached and brittle. Yet the wedding band, simple, worn, and engraved with the initials M and D, told its own story. The Grangers had worn matching bands, and Jamie confirmed the inscription within hours. Still, officials turned to dental records for certainty. Days later, the coroner's office made it official. The remains were those of Marcus Elwood Granger. The grief that had gripped the town for 3 weeks now shifted into a different kind of sorrow, one tinged with horror. Autopsy results, while limited due to decomposition, revealed key details. There were fractures on the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma, and microscopic fiber traces embedded in what remained of the wrist bones. Forensic analysts believed the fibers were from a nylon restraint, possibly a tie-down strap or rope. The findings suggested Marcus had been restrained and struck. Murder was no longer just a possibility. It was the reality. But despite this grim evidence, investigators were left with more questions than answers. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no clothing, no personal items, no murder weapon. No witnesses had seen Marcus that night. No one reported hearing anything. The scene had been wiped clean by nature and time. The challenge now was immense. Build a murder investigation on fragmentary remains and a single wedding band. For the people of Beckley Hollow, the shock ran deep. It was one thing to suspect foul play, another to see it confirmed with such finality. Marcus, the man who had once waved at neighbors from his garage and taught his son how to change a tire, was now at the center of a homicide case. Vigils were held. Flowers were left outside the garage door. Jamie retreated further into silence. His world had already shifted with his father's disappearance. Now it collapsed under the weight of this brutal truth. Detectives combed through Marcus's life, looking for any sign of conflict, any past customer with a grudge, any acquaintance with a motive. But nothing obvious emerged. The case was no longer about a missing man. It was about finding a killer. And with the physical evidence so scarce, the road ahead would be long and uncertain. With so little to go on, how would police find a killer? With the confirmation that Marcus Elwood Granger had been murdered, the case shifted into overdrive. The local sheriff's department formed a task force with the county's homicide unit. Detectives worked long hours, determined to catch whoever had taken the life of a man so deeply woven into the fabric of Beckley Hollow. The first wave of investigation focused on proximity. Who saw Marcus last? Who had reason, any reason, to want him gone? Jamie, now the lone member of the Granger family, was questioned first. He was calm, direct, grief-stricken. His timeline checked out. Phone records confirmed his call with Marcus at 6:15 p.m. Neighbors remembered seeing him home all evening. No one saw him leave the house. He was just a 15-year-old boy waiting for a father who never came home. Next came Marcus's clients. The teacher who had hired him to restore the Camaro was devastated. She'd last seen Marcus the week prior, had no personal connection beyond the project. Her alibi, dinner with family out of state, was verified quickly. Attention turned to former employees. One in particular raised eyebrows. A man named Lyle Benson, who had worked for Marcus briefly in 1995 before being let go over suspected theft from the cash drawer. He was known to hold a grudge, but when interviewed, Lyle was cooperative, even remorseful. He'd moved to Tennessee shortly after his firing, had pay stubs and a roommate vouching for his whereabouts the night Marcus disappeared. The lead fizzled. Theories started to sprout like weeds. Some believed Marcus may have witnessed something, a drug deal, an illegal dump site, something dangerous. Others whispered about debts, not Marcus's, but possibly someone else's, someone trying to send a message. There were even rumors of jealousy, a woman in town who may have harbored feelings Marcus didn't return, but all the speculation amounted to nothing concrete. No fingerprints on the truck, no weapon, no surveillance footage. The forest had swallowed what little evidence existed. The town's anxiety slowly gave way to resignation. Detectives came and went. The original case file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. Leads would surface. A call from someone who claimed they'd seen Marcus arguing at a gas station. A tip about a drifter seen near Old Mill Road. But each lead collapsed under scrutiny. As the months turned into years, Marcus's name came up less and less. The garage was sold to a developer who never followed through. The building sat vacant, slowly falling into disrepair. Weeds sprouting through cracks in the asphalt. Jamie moved in with his aunt 2 towns over, rarely returning to Beckley Hollow except on anniversaries or holidays. In the sheriff's evidence locker, the few artifacts of the case remained. The wedding band, the nylon fibers, copies of interviews, and a weathered manila folder labeled Granger. Marcus, homicide. The story of Marcus Granger began to shift in the town's memory, not as the mechanic who helped neighbors and raised his son with quiet pride, but as the man who disappeared one summer night and whose murder remained unsolved. The silence grew heavier with each passing year. But time, as it turns out, can be both a curse and a cure in criminal investigations. While some cases fade completely into darkness, others wait patiently for the right moment, when new eyes or new science finally shine a light. Would time bury the truth, or merely preserve it? By the spring of 2003, the case of Marcus Elwood Granger had officially gone cold. The folders were boxed and stored in the evidence room. Investigators were reassigned. And though the murder was never forgotten by those closest to it, it became clear that, for the moment, the trail had ended. Jamie Granger, once the wide-eyed 15-year-old waiting on a porch for his father to come home, was now a young man of 21. He had tried to hold on, to live in the town where every street reminded him of what was taken, but the weight of memory was too heavy. That year, he left Kentucky behind, moving north to Indiana where he enrolled in a technical school and tried to start a new life. Beckley Hollow changed too. New families moved in, old ones drifted out. The community that once buzzed with shared sorrow grew quieter. The Granger Auto Garage sat boarded up, weather-stripped paint peeling from its door. Eventually, the lot was sold, then resold. But the building remained untouched, like a tomb no one dared enter. In time, only a few in town continued to speak Marcus's name. But Jamie never forgot. Every August 14th, he made the quiet drive back into town. No press, no attention. He didn't call the sheriff's department, didn't ask for updates. He knew they had none. Instead, he parked near the spot on Old Mill Road, where the red Ford F-150 had been found so many years ago. And there, in the gravel by the tree line, he left a single white flower. It was his way of honoring a man who had given everything he had, only to be taken without a trace. Law enforcement still kept the case open on paper. But behind closed doors, most admitted what everyone feared. Without new evidence, the chances of solving Marcus's murder were close to zero. The forensics available in 1997 had been limited. No usable prints had been found. The rope fibers discovered near the remains were too degraded for reliable testing at the time. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, expensive, unreliable, and far from the breakthroughs that would come years later. In every cold case, there is a moment when silence becomes a second death, when even hope begins to fade. That moment came quietly for Marcus's case. One lead detective retired in 2005, another passed away in 2008. The boxes moved from one shelf to another, gathering dust like hundreds of other unsolved files across the state. Still, Jamie kept asking questions, even if he no longer asked them aloud. He read books on forensic advancements. He watched news coverage on cold cases being reopened with new science, and every time he heard of DNA solving a murder long thought lost, a small part of him held on, because Marcus Granger wasn't just a file. He was his father, a man who had fixed cars by day and grilled burgers by night. A man who loved quietly, lived simply, and deserved justice. The years pressed forward. The world changed. But the truth, buried somewhere in the forgotten corners of a forest, had not moved. What no one knew, not even Jamie, was that across the country, in laboratories and police departments, a new wave of technology was silently rewriting the rules of time. But across the country, science was about to catch up with the past. By 2021, a new era in criminal justice had quietly emerged, one where old evidence spoke new truths. Across the country, cold case units began dusting off files long thought unsolvable. Advances in DNA analysis, particularly mitochondrial and touch DNA, were making it possible to revisit evidence that had been deemed useless decades ago. That year, Kentucky's Cold Case Division received a long-awaited funding boost through a federal grant aimed at applying modern forensic science to the state's backlog of unsolved murders. The goal was simple: give forgotten victims a voice and families a chance at closure. Marcus Granger's file, marked Cold 1997 Homicide, was one of the first to be reviewed. When investigators pulled the box from storage, they found what remained of the physical evidence: the original crime scene photographs, skeletal reports, the wedding band, and most critically, a sealed plastic evidence bag containing a piece of rope. The frayed nylon strand recovered near Marcus's remains had been tested in 1997 with no usable results. But now, thanks to mitochondrial DNA testing and improved extraction methods, that same rope held potential. Technicians at the state forensic lab worked methodically, shaving down microscopic fragments of the rope, carefully isolating the minuscule traces of biological material trapped within its fibers. It took weeks. But when the results came in, they confirmed the presence of male mitochondrial DNA, not Marcus's. It wasn't enough to create a full genetic profile. but it was sufficient to generate a partial sequence. That sequence was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the FBI's national database of genetic material from criminal offenders, arrestees, and forensic samples. Then came the waiting. For weeks, investigators checked the system daily, hoping for a match. Most cold case hits, if they ever came, took months, sometimes years, but in this case it took just 26 days. A hit. The DNA was linked to a man named Dale Henry Voss, who had submitted a genetic sample during his 2018 arrest for felony assault in Missouri. Voss had pleaded out and served less than a year, but his DNA had remained in the system. The lab's results were reviewed and verified. The statistical match to the rope sample was considered significant. It wasn't conclusive proof of guilt, not yet, but it was the first real break in the Granger case in over 2 decades. Investigators dug deeper. Voss's record showed a pattern of violent behavior. Minor incidents scattered across multiple states, bar fights, restraining orders, threats, but no prior charges for homicide. At first glance, he appeared to be just another repeat offender who slipped through the cracks. But as they traced his past, a chilling realization emerged. In 1997, Dale Voss had lived in Kentucky, not just anywhere in Kentucky. He had lived in Beckley Hollow. Who was this man? And what was his connection to Marcus? Dale Henry Voss was not a name that rang bells when it first appeared in the reopened Granger case file. To the detectives who had spent months poring over long-forgotten reports, he was just another name, until they looked closer. Voss was 52 when the DNA match was returned. In 1997, he had been 26, working as a tow truck operator in rural Kentucky. Specifically, his logs and employment records placed him in and around Beckley Hollow during the summer Marcus Granger was murdered. His company, a small-time local operator called Redline Recovery, had occasionally serviced vehicles at Granger Auto. Marcus and Voss had crossed paths before, perhaps briefly, perhaps often. That connection made the DNA match far more than coincidence. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Voss had left Kentucky abruptly in late 1997, just weeks after Marcus's body was discovered. He relocated to Missouri, where he seemed to keep a low profile for years. On paper, there was little to raise suspicion. No violent felonies, no murder charges. But as time went on, a pattern emerged. Bar fights, domestic disturbances, a protective order from a former partner. None of the incidents had resulted in prison time, but each added to a portrait of a volatile man. When detectives from the Kentucky State Police and Missouri law enforcement visited Voss at his current job, a shipping facility outside Springfield, he was calm. Polite, even. He said he barely remembered Beckley Hollow. Said he'd towed a lot of cars in his time. Couldn't say for sure if he remembered Marcus Granger. But something didn't sit right. His demeanor was rehearsed, his answers vague. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't protest. A search warrant for his property and old employment records painted a clearer picture. Voss had indeed towed vehicles from Granger Auto on multiple occasions. A work log showed he'd been called in by Marcus twice during the summer of '97 for after-hours pickups. His last documented contact with the shop was 2 weeks before Marcus disappeared. Further, analysis of archived phone records, long since, boxed up but digitized during the cold case review, revealed something even more telling. A call from a number associated with Voss's landline to Granger Auto on the afternoon of August 14th, 1997. Just hours before Marcus vanished. It wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough for a warrant. On a chilly morning in March 2023, Voss was arrested at his job site without incident. He said little. His co-workers watched in stunned silence as plainclothes officers walked him out in cuffs. The shock reverberated all the way back to Beckley Hollow. Some residents remembered Voss and a quiet man with a short fuse who kept to himself. Others were blindsided. No one had ever suspected he could be involved in something like this. Rumors reignited. Old wounds reopened. Jamie Granger, now in his early 40s, received the call while at work. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, he asked only one question. "Are you sure it's him?" The arrest made headlines across Kentucky. A 26-year-old murder cracked by DNA. a long-forgotten name pulled from the shadows. But arrests are not convictions, and evidence, no matter how compelling, still had to stand up in court. Voss maintained his innocence. His lawyer called the evidence circumstantial, the DNA transfer unreliable, and the case a stretch born of desperation. Would the courts believe the case after all these years? The Commonwealth of Kentucky versus Dale Henry Voss began on a cold morning in February 2024. The courthouse in Lexington was subdued, but the weight of what it represented filled the air. It wasn't just another trial, it was a reckoning. For Jamie Granger, now 42, it was the moment he had been waiting for since the night his father never came home. Jamie sat in the front row every day, behind the prosecution table. His expression was unreadable, equal parts resolve and exhaustion. He had lived this case for 27 years. He didn't expect peace, but he needed answers. The prosecution's case hinged on 3 pillars: the mitochondrial DNA evidence found on the rope near Marcus's remains, a newly unearthed testimony from a former co-worker who recalled Voss complaining about a financial dispute with Marcus in 1997, and the sudden relocation of Voss just weeks after the murder. Lead prosecutor Maria Chen laid it out clearly in her opening statement. This case is not about luck. It's about patience. It's about a man who was taken too soon and the trail of evidence his killer left behind. The DNA evidence, while partial, placed Voss at the crime scene. A forensic specialist explained the strength of mitochondrial matches and the improbability of random contact. Then came the motive. A former dispatcher for Redline Recovery testified that Voss had felt cheated by Marcus over a canceled tow contract, a dispute worth only a few $100s. Voss allegedly said, "Granger thinks he can stiff me and walk away. He's got another thing coming." It wasn't a smoking gun, but it showed animosity. The timeline was reinforced by phone logs and Voss's work history, confirming his call to Granger Auto the afternoon Marcus disappeared. His relocation to Missouri just weeks after the discovery of the body painted a picture of evasion. The defense focused on doubt. Voss's attorney argued that the DNA evidence could have been transferred in any number of innocent ways, especially given Voss's prior business relationship with Marcus. He challenged the integrity of evidence storage, highlighting the decades that had passed since the rope had been collected. He emphasized the lack of direct eyewitnesses, the absence of a murder weapon, and the fallibility of human memory. But it wasn't just the science, it was the story. Jamie took the stand, calm, controlled. He recounted the last phone call with his father, the night spent waiting, the years of silence, the flower he laid every year on Old Mill Road. It wasn't legal evidence, but it was powerful. In closing arguments, Chen reminded the jury, "Time has passed, yes, but the truth has remained." After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent. Voss showed no emotion. Jamie, for the first time in decades, exhaled. But as reporters filed their stories and the town buzzed with closure, one question lingered in Jamie's heart. A quiet echo in the back of the courtroom. But beyond the conviction, what does justice really mean after 27 years? With the conviction of Dale Henry Voss in 2024, the case of Marcus Elwood Granger was finally closed, on paper. But for Jamie Granger, closure was far more complicated than a courtroom verdict. Justice, he would say later, doesn't erase time. It doesn't give you back birthdays, holidays, or the long talks on the porch that never happened. It doesn't replace a father's hand on your shoulder during a first heartbreak, or his voice in the crowd at graduation. It doesn't stand beside you at your wedding or hold your newborn son. And yet justice mattered, because it told the world and Jamie that Marcus's life was worth remembering, and his death was not forgotten. In the spring of 2025, the town of Beckley Hollow did something they hadn't done in years. They gathered. With approval from the city council and the full support of the Granger family, the stretch of Route 16 where Granger Auto once stood was officially renamed Granger Way. On the same day, a bronze memorial plaque was installed near the spot where Marcus's truck had been found in 1997, along Old Mill Road. It reads in memory of Marcus Elwood Granger, 1956-1997, a father, a friend, a neighbor. Taken too soon, never forgotten. People came out in numbers, some who hadn't spoken Marcus's name in years, some who only knew the story from their parents. Others who remembered every oil change, every handshake, every quiet kindness. They stood side by side as Jamie, now a father himself, stepped up to speak. "My dad didn't leave this town because he wanted to," Jamie said. "He was taken. And for a long time this place carried that silence, but not anymore. Now his name lives here again, not just in tragedy, but in honor." Beyond the ceremony, the impact of the case rippled outward. The attention surrounding Marcus's murder, and its eventual resolution, led the Kentucky State Police to review its backlog of cold cases. Funding was increased for forensic analysis. A special task force was established to revisit unsolved crimes from the 1980s and 1990s, focusing on DNA evidence collected before modern testing techniques. Granger's case became a model of how patience, science, and determination could break through silence. It was shared at law enforcement conferences. It was used in training modules. It became a case study in what was possible. For Jamie, it brought a new purpose. He began speaking at cold case support groups advocating for families still waiting. He wasn't just Marcus's son anymore. He was part of a growing movement of survivors who refused to let time erase truth. Yet even in the joy of resolution, one question remained, not just for Jamie, but for communities across the country. If DNA could solve this case after 27 years, if one piece of rope could speak decades later, if one voice could reopen a case buried in silence, what other truths lie waiting in old evidence boxes across America? For 27 long years, the disappearance of Marcus Elwood Granger cast a quiet shadow over Beckley Hollow, Kentucky. It was more than just a cold case. It was a wound, left open and aching in the heart of a community, and in the life of a son who never stopped searching for answers. Marcus was never meant to be a headline. He lived simply. He worked with his hands, raised his son with quiet devotion, and gave more than he ever asked for. But one night in 1997, everything was stolen. His future, his voice, his presence. And for decades, all that remained were questions, until science caught up with time. Through advancements in DNA testing and renewed efforts from cold case investigators, a single frayed rope told a story that no one could hear back then. That thread led to Dale Henry Voss, the man responsible for Marcus's death. And in 2024, after nearly 3 decades, a courtroom finally delivered the justice that had long been denied. But this case became more than a conviction. It sparked change, in policy, in funding, in awareness. Kentucky's cold case division expanded. Other families, once silenced by time, began to hope again. Marcus Granger's legacy now lives on, not just in the road that bears his name, or the memorial that marks his loss, but in the reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. This story is about remembrance. It's about resilience. And it's about the truth that refuses to stay buried. If you believe every victim deserves justice, and share this story, let Marcus's name echo louder than the silence that once surrounded him.